Thanks very much, Michael. In fact, I'm a former All-Ireland champion accordion player. And in my culture, I have to say that's much more important than academic distinctions. Gabor related to his incident at Customs and Immigration. I had a similar experience about two years ago going through the US, which I will relate to you. As you probably noticed, most of my hair is white now, except on my passport photograph, I'm depicted as having black hair. So the lady behind the counter looked very troubled, and I said, oh my God, at last they've caught up with me. I will not be let in. She turned up and she said to me, you need Grecian 2000 coming. True as God. So thank you very much, Tim, for having me here, and Michael, and CACL, and OSI. I consider Michael back, and this is a compliment, to be the Jimi Hendrix of Article 12. Without the mudslides. The title of my talk is Rethinking Personhood, New Directions in Legal Capacity Law and Policy. At one level, it's about the so-called paradigm shift in Article 12 of the Convention, and in reality, it's about a war of ideas, a clash of creeds, if you will. And let me anticipate immediately what you're thinking. It's that if I hear one more person sprouting platitudes about the paradigm shift, I might be inclined toward random acts of violence. In a flight of fancy, I often imagine the paradigm shift as a new, shiny electric car with a new gear shift mechanism powered by a patented paradigm ion impulse engine. We all know that the old model of petrol-driven cars and a hydrocarbon-based economy has had its day and must go. And we all know that petrol cars are not good for the environment, and that the economic base which petrol underpins is just not sustainable. For Americans, I apologize, that should be gasoline. Of course, there is an inconvenience to the switch to the electric car, but I think nearly everyone shares deep intuition that change isn't just good, but it's inevitable. We resist it in our everyday lives, mainly because of inconvenience, but we know our resistance is futile. So the process of change is inevitable from a hydrocarbon economy to a green one, despite the undertow exercised by powerful vested interests. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that the process of change initiated by Article 12, away from substitute decision-making, even with elaborate safeguards, and toward a model of supported decision-making, seems much more fraught than the march toward a green economy. The resistance seems much more deeply embedded, and the proponents of change, us, are easily boxed in and labelled as idealists or worse. Why is this process of change so fraught? Why is endemic, socially damaging, personally dangerous, incorrigible decision-making for the rest of us tolerated, and not for persons with disabilities? This is what I want to try and crack open. By the paradigm shift, I mean three things, three simple things. I mean the shift away from treating people with disabilities as objects to be managed and cared for, to honouring and respecting them as subjects. I mean restoring voice, power and authority to the self over him or herself. And I mean respecting this power and authority by forging pathways to independent living and participation. And so legal capacity to me is a continuum that connects with everything needed to enable human flourishing. A right to make decisions and to have them respected. A place of one's own. A life in the community connected to friends, acquaintances and social capital, whether in public or in private settings. Personhood to me is much broader and deeper than just capacity to make decisions. And these broader connections, I think, serve to augment capacity in a virtuous circle. Article 12, as you know, is the lightning rod for the paradigm shift. To my mind, to your mind, it supplants easy assumptions about incapacity and replaces them with a qualitatively different way of framing the human condition, and have seen fragility as a universal condition, and by demanding supports to enable persons with disabilities chart their own life course. Supports that we all actually take for granted and enjoy in our everyday lives. So this talk is not an exposition or just one more exposition on the legal requirements of Article 12. There's plenty of that around. It's not an attempt to directly solve some thorny questions like, how do we make sure supported decision-making does not morph into substitute decision-making? Rather, it explores why this is a thorny question in the first place. I want to explore why these issues arise and register as issues. Why are they boxed off into disability when in fact they touch on universal experiences? What is it? What blind spot exists in the underpinning of our political discourse that make these issues appear unique and exaggeratedly so in the context of intellectual disability? Maybe by identifying where the tension truly lies at the base, can we forge a more sustainable pathway for reform and allow more breathing space for the paradigm shift. So let's start by being honest. We, the converted, see this vision of change in Article 12 as inevitable. Yet others, including important gatekeepers such as policymakers, legislators, service providers, and families, have their doubts. I suppose they're not so much clearly articulated doubts, but more like the undertow applied by accepted ways of doing things. That's the curious thing about old paradigms. Like old soldiers, they don't necessarily fade away. Even when people commit verbally to a new paradigm, they often have mental reservations, reservations that they themselves might not be fully aware of, and which have the effect of deflecting progress toward the new paradigm. I think there's nothing new here. Some years ago, the British Overseas Development Office tried to figure out why 1 billion in development aid in a particular country left no mark whatsoever. Actually, the 11 million bill for the wedding today is pittance. A key finding of this was that, contrary to popular misconceptions, policymakers actually work to very simple policy narratives that either facilitate, block, skew, distort, or deflect change. They are shorthand and even a substitute for deep thinking. That's fine and even normal. We can't all think deeply all the time. In our context, the relevant policy narratives could be as simple as disability costs, therefore, or we have an elaborate system already in place, so why experiment, especially when there are known risks and no clear way of mitigating them? There are unknowable risks that could arise and we have no clue how to deal with them. The first is willingly blind to a more sophisticated cost-benefit analysis that might well show that change is both desirable and achievable. And the second panders to the inherently risk-averse nature of the policy apparatus. After all, the fewer mistakes you make as a civil servant, the higher you go, at least in my country, and I suspect elsewhere. The conclusion of the British study was that unless these often irrational policy narratives are dissolved and broadened, then little change of a lasting nature is possible. No amount of money will make a lasting difference unless new ways of looking at things become accepted as common sense and worth taking the risk. But common sense turns out not to be so common. By the way, the British study impliedly poured cold water over the so-called evidence-based approach to policy making. Evidence counts, but certainly not in the unilinear way imagined by the white-coated social scientist. The policy world is just too messy for that. So we, the converted, like to think that the logic of Article